Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Bill Golderer. I'm honored to serve the mission of the United Way of Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey. And I'm going to let Carson Hicks, my new friend, introduce herself to you. But I think the premise of this conversation builds upon something that I know that we have some deep alignment with the citizen, and I think they cover this incredibly well, which is though we may not have all the answers, I think while many of us have become numb to, I think, poverty statistics. I mean, we have this kind of contrast that is ongoing, right? The National Geographic, or I think that's what it was, just published that there's 20 places you should visit in 2020, and the only North American city they mentioned was Philadelphia, right? Which is amazing, right? And, you know, restaurants, hospitality, you know, tech scene, a lot of things going in the right direction. And even though we did see a moderate reduction in the poverty rate, my perspective, and I'm not alone in this, is that a city of 1.1 million neighbors, of which 400,000 are really suffering, and a city that's 43% African American and small business ownership is held by only 2% of our population of African Americans owned and held. I would say this is rising to the level of crisis. And the question before us is, you know, how can we learn from other markets who recognize the greatness of their city and are proud, as all of us are, and I am, of our city, deep pride in who we are. But part of being proud is insisting that it be better and that prosperity touch more people and that the American dream be true not just for the few, but for all, and that sort of was the vision of the founders 15 blocks from here. So we have some insight, I think, to glean from what is happening up 75 miles from here in New York. And Carson Hicks is one of the, for 13 years, has been working tirelessly on a meaningful and measurable approach to poverty reduction in the city of New York. And so would you all welcome Carson to Philadelphia?
Thanks so much, Bill. I'm super thrilled to be here for the day. I think this is absolutely terrific, and I'm so delighted to be talking about the work of our office.
So let's start there. Can you just lead us off? Tell me about the office, how you found your way into it, and what it does.
Sure. So in late 2006, the then Mayor Bloomberg, who was in his second term, had a commission that was comprised of business leaders, philanthropic members, academic folks, who sort of took a lay of the land and said, what more can we be doing around poverty? This commission process came back with a set of recommendations, and the Center for Economic Opportunity, which was sort of the original form of my office, was established to bring out those recommendations. Flash forward, we are now the Mayor's Office for Economic Opportunity. We're obviously located within the Office of the Mayor in New York City. We focus on poverty reduction. It's all about building evidence for effective strategies to reduce poverty and really focusing in on innovation as well. I came in 2007. I was a newly minted PhD who didn't know a lot about government but was passionate about poverty. And was drawn by the basic premise of my office, which is, if it's not working, stop funding it. So essentially...
Wait, whoa, what? One more time.
If it's not working, stop funding it. That was pretty much the philosophy. You know, try it out, test it, tweak it, measure the impact. But if it's not working, stop the funding. Which is easier said than done, which I'm happy to get into. But that was just really compelling for me. So now I'm the Deputy Executive Director. I've been there for a long time, as Bill alluded to. The work has expanded over the years. Our office has doubled in size. We do a whole variety of different things, from program development, evaluation, design digital solutions to problems. We do human-centered design, behavioral design, all sorts of things, and it's really just been very satisfying for me. I don't know how to put it any other way.
So let's get into that. So there's, what I've gleaned is that there has been meaningful and measurable poverty reduction. You started in a place, you've seen reduction, and while, as you say, the whole thing is about innovation. There's got to be an appetite to fail, and yet you have gained, over the time that you've been working on this, I'm guessing some critical insight as to what is working, what are things you started working on that you probably, if you had it to do over, you would do differently. How has your mind changed about your approach over this time?
So I think one of the really most important things that we did very early on was recognize, and sorry, we're not alone in this, the federal poverty measure is not adjusted for geographic differences in the cost of living. So for places like New York City or Philadelphia, that's a real problem where the cost of living is significantly higher than other parts of the country. So we decided we were going to create our own measure. It was based on the recommendations of the National Academy of Sciences. And we spent some serious time creating that measure, and it is a local measure for New York City that takes into account a lot more things than the federal measure does, both on the kind of resources that are available to families. So the federal measure just takes into account pre-tax cash income, and we take into account things like tax credits and subsidies and other things that are available to families who are living in poverty. And then on the threshold side, so the federal threshold is the same across the country. So for a family of four, and I don't have the exact number, but it's about $25,000. You're below earning $25,000. You're below that, you're in poverty. You're above that, you're not in poverty. That's the same threshold in New York City, in Philly, in rural Mississippi. That does not make sense, right? The cost of living, as I mentioned, is higher in certain places. So on the threshold side, we adjust that threshold higher based on things like the cost of housing and other things. And so what we end up is with a very nuanced measure for New York City. And when you get a more nuanced measure of poverty that's based on the locality that you live in, you come to understand that folks who we may have thought really are high and have high poverty rates, such as women with young children, may not have quite as high because so much of the federal policy, things like the earned income tax credit, other things have been targeted for decades to that very population. So I'm not saying there's no poverty, I'm just saying it's not quite as high as you might expect. And the elderly, for whom many, at the federal level didn't think there was a super high poverty rate, actually have a higher poverty rate because they've got things like out-of-pocket medical expenses that aren't covered through health insurance, et cetera. So you get a nuanced picture of poverty, and that helps you tailor your interventions based on who's in poverty and where they may be living, for an example, in New York City. So you can get a much better and more precise targeting of where you want to apply your different interventions.
So let's keep going on that, because I feel like in Philadelphia there is a growing appetite to dig in around this and really create a comprehensive, well-capitalized, coordinated campaign around meaningful and measurable poverty reduction. I guess my question to you, and there's two things that are barriers to that, I think, lifting off. One is, I think when you hear the statistics and you kind of get your arms around how stubborn our challenges with poverty are, some folks kind of just go to this place of, that's not going to work no matter what we do. It's just too overwhelming, right? It's just too, it just overwhelms you and say, where would we even start? And the second response is, there's just 1,000 boutique and fragmented efforts that are ongoing, and it's really, and that's appropriate. But I guess the question I would have for you is, how did you go about using data, other insights you gleaned about this idea of goal setting and creating targets and And how did that goal setting and targeting, creating targets, advance or hinder what you were doing?
So there's kind of two different levels in which this takes place. At the city level, the city issues essentially a report every 4 years. It's a strategic plan, essentially, for the city. And the last two reports that have been issued have really prioritized poverty reduction goals, issues relating to equity, et cetera. There's also sort of within my office and what we do around wanting to see specific interventions have, effects on poverty, setting specific targets for programs, and really understanding whether or not those things are in fact being working, essentially, whether or not they're being effective. And not, you said this earlier, like you have to have room to fail. We've done hundreds of, tried different projects and different solutions. Maybe 30% has actually been, successful to some degree or another. So that's been a lot of things that haven't worked, but it's like kind of that persistence and that focal point and the keep trying it and keep tinkering and see if you can come up with the effective strategies. I think the other thing that has been really important that you alluded to is sort of this coordination effort. There are a lot of different strands and fragmentations of different things that are going on. City agencies, nonprofit community, which is a huge partner, that are focused on poverty. And there's a reason why we're in the mayor's office. And that is an attempt then to coordinate all of these various parties and sort of have that everybody focus on a common core mission of poverty reduction. And I think that's been really instrumental over the years to bring people to the table and to have everybody be able to have that common focus, because city agencies, as they do here, they have their missions. They have things that they have to do. Poverty may be part of it, but it may not be 100% of what they're there to do.
So let's build off that, which is, I think many of us are trying to think through, well, if that were to kind of happen here, when you say, and I mean absolutely no disrespect here, but if you said, where does this start? Government is probably not the first word out of the mouth of a lot of people in Philadelphia, but there is this issue of scale and scope, and that we're not trying to move a few folks. We're trying to really have an ambitious goal here. And so what I've heard you say before in another conversation was about the importance of partnerships, the importance of everyone from constituent voice to community organizations to traditional philanthropy, private sector, and government working arm in arm. And one of the things about Philadelphia I love and is challenging is that it's a contact sport here to do anything. And one of the barriers is what we call the MET, right? Money, ego, and turf. Who gets to say. And I guess the question is, what have been the things that you have been able to do to level set, to keep the mission and the urgency of the mission front and center, to kind of drive the impact you've had that we could learn from through these partnerships that are necessary, right?
I mean, you build on your successes. We've had some really impactful programs, a couple of which, one of which is a program that helps students at community colleges earn their associate degrees. Wildly successful. CUNY ASAP is what it's called. That's a partnership with our local city university system. We've had other successes that are focused on workforce and things like that. And I think those successes, our willingness to bring money to the table, to measure it, to see if it actually works, the close monitoring, et cetera, I think that folks have really responded well to that. It's been very interesting over time. In fact, when I started in 2007, evaluation was not something that was commonly done, certainly not within government, and there was a real question about whether or not we should be spending dollars doing evaluation work when you could be investing in programming or other things. That narrative has completely 100% changed. And the fact that we are committed to evaluating everything that we fund and do, I think has really drawn our partners and keeps the focus on the mission and moving forward, because you can tell whether or not the money in the investment is actually making a difference.
So maybe talk about the tension, or if there is a tension in your work between programmatic intervention, right? Testing, gauging, what happened when we did this, and that whole that could feel as though it's an intervention, it's capitalized, it's measured against the hopes we had for it, and then we see if people's lives were really affected and impacted. And that's one way of affecting poverty. And then there is the policy lever. Like if you're in the mayor's office, you can now pull both. I guess the question that I would have is, how does your office think about, because there are some in our market who just go right to policy as a thing we should do, and then there's others who are like, well, I'm not sure, I prefer programs. And I see an interesting interplay where you are around that. And can you just talk about the how you strike a balance, or how you think about programmatic intervention and then policy?
So I think both are important. I think you get a bigger bang for your buck when you actually do both. Sometimes it's easier in some respects to do programmatic interventions if you can fund them. But policy is equally important. So when we first started, it really was about the programmatic interventions and excuse me, standing those up and evaluating them. But over time, it really also has been about systems change, how government does business around poverty reduction more broadly. And really, our office has pivoted a little bit to focusing in on systems change within government, and how we can be investing dollars as government more wisely, producing better outcomes, using evidence to drive policy. So that's can folks hear me? Good.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's our calling card. We want to use data and evidence to drive policy making and decision making, and we think it's a super duper important thing to do.
And building on that, that's there's policy, and then there's, since this sits inside the city, has what you found and what you've been working on helped city government to hold a mirror up to itself and say, maybe there are some things that we are doing advertently or inadvertently that are frustrating our progress? Like, has this led to any internal reforms of like city departments, or like folks at least working more cohesively? Just as a quick aside, I sat with a relatively new member of city council who is incredibly diligent, and shared with me, just went on she has deep knowledge, I came away from this, of the water department. It was amazing. Like, she's got deep knowledge of the water department and the ways in which that is going to be working against things we're trying to do. Nothing against them, but just like she just was very curious. And I'm wondering if you can help us understand how your work has kind of affected and impacted how government does its work.
So I would say there's, pockets of this happening more within government, or, in certain areas of government than others. But really the use of the questions we're asking, like what evidence is there for a specific strategy? Is there evidence before the investment is made, for an example? And if there's not, great, like can we do some evaluation work and see if we can build some evidence for this type of strategy. The program that I was talking about earlier, the CUNY ASAP, that program that's been so successful, that has really driven change within CUNY about how they produce their graduates. They have that program has been evaluated numerous times, and it doubles graduation rates. Like that's what it does over and over again. And so CUNY has really taken pieces of that particular model and applied it wherever it can to help students persist and graduate, again, at the community college level. So we're seeing that people are looking at data, They're looking and using evaluation and they're thinking about evidence as they are making decisions about investments. Now, it's a process and it takes time. And, there's still, I think, a lot of work to be done, but we've definitely made a lot of progress over the past 12 years.
So one more question, and then maybe we'll see if there's some interest in conversation from the group that's gathered here. Two-parter. First, looking back, could you share, just from a personal sense, like, what has been the most deeply gratifying advancement or accomplishment that the collective effort has yielded to you personally, Carson? Like the thing that it resonates with you the deepest, like a real thing that you're proud of, recognizing a lot of people worked on it. And then second, what's next? Like what's ahead? What is the next hill you're going to climb, and what's it going to take?
I feel like I keep repeating the same story. When I came in, the first project I worked on was that CUNY community college program. So I would have to say, for me personally, that has been one of the most kind of just impactful things that we've done. It's also, so I've been there during 2 different mayoral administrations, and what started out as serving 1,000 students now serves 25,000 students. So it's like serving, I think, about half of all eligible students at CUNY, and is hopefully going to be growing even bigger. So to just witness that kind of like change and the impact on the system that's had, it's been hugely gratifying. In terms of what's next, I think our office has been looking at a variety of different areas to focus on. Equity has really been a huge thing. There were some local laws that passed and an executive order that was recently signed by Mayor de Blasio that really is asking city agencies to take a very close look at their practices and policies around issues related to equity and sort of race and gender and things like that, and essentially look for disparities and figure out how they're going to address them. To me, that work has the potential to be hugely transformative for the way government does business. So I'm really excited about seeing where that goes, and my office is providing guidance along the way. We're also focused in a lot more on sort of early childhood interventions because that's really where you can also, in the longer term, get a huge, bang for your buck, but like really transform people's lives, really set children, young people, et cetera, on their path to economic opportunities. So I think, between those two things, there's a lot that may be coming down the pike in the future that's something to look forward to.
Excellent. So I think we can...
You want me to... Questions? Get a little workout here.
Hi. 2, I hope, related things. First, in terms of a time horizon, you ended up talking about early childhood education as having a long-term benefit. What's been the time horizon for your evaluations to say something works or doesn't work, since the office has been in place for 12 years? And given what David Muhammad talked about earlier with matching your action with your objective, I'm just curious for you to reflect a little bit on that time horizon, when you expect impact. And then related to that, in terms of partners, I know a little bit about the work of the Robin Hood Foundation. That's a private philanthropy in New York that's focused on poverty. And could you talk about your collaboration with them and other philanthropies there?
Sure. So the first question, time horizon around evaluation, it really does vary by the type of evaluation that you're doing. And one of the things that I will say is, being in the mayor's office, we're sort of in a political term, like as long as the mayor's there and folks want to see results quickly, which evaluation doesn't always produce quickly, I will admit that. Rigorous evaluation, in particular, when you want to look at longer term effects, takes time, and not always, the 4 years or whatever the time period that a mayor in our case is in office. So we do rigorous performance monitoring that really can, we're looking at outcomes just every step along the way. so that we can start reporting out what we think is happening with programs. And we'll do different types of evaluations so that we can speak a little bit. But like that longer term impact, if you will, that can take a longer term time horizon. And it can be frustrating, I admit, but like I also think it's really important work. As to our local philanthropies, we've actually partnered with quite a few of them. We have partnered with Robin Hood, over the years, frankly, on a couple of different projects. They have invested in, keep circling back to this great program model. We're doing a 4-year version of it now because we want to see if it's effective at the baccalaureate level. So they've invested in a cohort. We've invested in a cohort. We're working with John Jay School of Criminal Justice on that particular project. We've worked with numerous other foundations. Having philanthropy at the table has been really great and important. And I will say, just sort of over the past 12 years, just sort of looking back, sometimes when you're trying to do projects where there isn't a lot of evidence or that might be perceived as controversial, it's sometimes a little easier to do that with philanthropic funds rather than like city dollars. You know, people can, and rightly so, are not always comfortable wanting to put city dollars into something that's experimental. And so, without philanthropy, I'm not sure that we would have been able to do many of some of the more cutting edge projects that we've done over the years.
Any other questions? Anyone? Another one?
Larry.
What's that? This is less of a walk. Sorry, dude.
Two questions. Can you tell us a little bit about the demographics of the 140,000 people that have been lifted out of poverty in terms of age, sex? And the second question is, can you describe in more detail, put some more meat on this college program and what it is and why it's so successful?
I can tell you more about, yes, who's getting out of poverty. It's not, that's a figure that's been put out there, and what I'd like to talk more about is our actual poverty rate and reduction. There's been lots of different groups that over time, so African American, Blacks, if you will, women, various ethnic groups have all experienced poverty reduction over the years that we have been measuring it, which is terrific. And in any given year, you sometimes see some groups go up and some groups go down, but the fact that we can actually take a closer look and see who is experiencing the ups and downs has been tremendously helpful. In terms of the college program, I'd like to say it's not rocket science. It basically removes most barriers that students have to persisting in college. It does require full-time enrollment, although that obviously can and is tailored, like if students are working and things like that. It doesn't have to be, your classic during the day. It provides academic and tuition support, essentially, transportation support. So students are getting books, they're getting dedicated classes, they have advisors, which is a huge thing. So while advisors are readily available at most community colleges, a lot of students don't go because they're not compelled to, and yet a real significant problem is students don't always know what classes they need to take in order to graduate, like what they need to take for their major and things like that. So advisement is a requirement for this program. And so we get students to and through, and it's with those different programmatic elements that really are having the impact that we're seeing.
One more? Who was that all the way up here? Come on down here and meet me. Man, I am really out of shape. I got to get in the gym. It's Binswanger.
I'm Binswanger. My question, I actually had two. I think I'll go with this one. A lot of what I see government focused on is sort of like making things less expensive for people so they can afford them. But the other side of the coin is helping them make more money, move them up the chain. How do you deal with that?
So a lot of the interventions that one of the things that we've sort of identified that has been a problem over the years is whether or not people have the appropriate skills for any particular type of employment. And so we are very interested in sort of career ladders and entry points and making sure that people have kind of like the minimum credentials, be it educational or otherwise, to enter into an entry level job, and then kind of identifying career ladders and sort of skills that they can acquire along the way so that they can move up that career ladder. When we first started, a lot of the programs that we were doing were focused on helping people get what was then the general equivalency diploma, which is now the high school, well, HSC, I can't recall exactly what that stands for. But also just getting people actual skills like OSHA training and other things, perhaps not the best example, but basically training that can really help people advance in their career trajectories and essentially earn more money. So we are about acquiring that skill set so that folks can stick in the labor market and have greater economic mobility.
Carson, thank you so much for coming to Philadelphia. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right. We're going to take a short break for you to get some caffeine and some snacks, courtesy of Brandywine Realty. But stick around because we're closing the day with a really inspiring speaker, Taylor Paul. You trust me, you don't want to miss this dude. Thanks, everyone.